Today we're talking to Dr. Peter Wilton, who teaches strategy, marketing, and international management at the Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley. Wilton has received numerous awards and fellowships for his work in management, including from the National Science Foundation as well as the Marketing Science Institute. In the U.S., he has been recognized by Businessweek magazine as one of the country's leading business instructors. Among others, his global clients include Cisco Systems, Sun Microsystems, Apple Computer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and Rockwell International. Wilton holds a Bachelor of Commerce, first-class honors from the University of New South Wales in Australia, and a PhD in management from Purdue University in the United States. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. Today, I want to talk to you about innovation. It's the word of the day. It's the word of the millennium.
Absolutely.
Perhaps overused, perhaps misused. Yeah. Help define what is innovation.
Yeah, it's like the word quality. It means many different things to many different people. The way I like to think about it most productively is it's the organization's willingness to challenge the assumptions. Assumptions about how to efficiently and effectively create value for the organization's clients or other stakeholders if they're a non-profit organization.
Okay. Talk to me then, what's an innovative culture in businesses today? What is that?
Well, it's this culture internally where people are not afraid to actually challenge the assumptions about what the organization's been doing. And it's quite interesting when you think about this because the organizations that are least likely to challenge their assumptions are the most successful ones. When you're successful, there's a very strong tendency and a strong belief, strong consensus in the organization that the best thing to do is to keep doing the things that have made you successful up until this point. So what we often observe is that the organizations that have a really hard time, particularly with reframing or disruptive innovation, are the most successful organizations. So that's a cultural and a leadership challenge that I think is very difficult for a lot of successful organizations to master.
So you mentioned reframing, you mentioned disruption. Let's pause for a second. Give us definitions again.
Sure. Sustaining innovation. So there's a spectrum of innovation and it ranges from sustaining to disruptive or reframing. These are slightly different terms, but let me explain them. Sustaining innovation is really any attempt to incrementally improve something that already exists. So to be an organization that is already successful, and they have a goal of being 5% or 10% better or more efficient next year. And so it's continuous improvement, it's incremental, but it's fundamentally based on something that is already in existence in the market. Disruptive or reframing innovation is something that doesn't exist. It's a new approach to creating value for the organization's customers. It's something that was previously unrecognized or something that the incumbents considered impossible to do. And when it's launched, when it's introduced, because it's new, it always involves educating the customer about what those possibilities are and how to take advantage of them. So we have this difference between sustaining and disruptive. The classic term disruptive, as advanced by Professor Christensen at Harvard, suggests that new innovation always takes place in a low-cost form. I like to use the term reframing because reframing is a broader term. It's not necessarily confined to low-cost innovation. It could be launched at an existing segment of customers, which are willing to pay quite a lot of money, but it fundamentally reframes how people think about the providers of value and what the options are in a market.
So I know you've done a lot of work with and consulted with Apple. Let's make this more concrete. Tell me about Apple and what it means. Sure.
Well, Apple has a really interesting formula. We're not quite sure where this formula came from, but it's certainly a formula that has survived the demise of Steve Jobs. The formula is pretty simple. If you take the first part of the formula, what Apple will always do is they will do something sustaining. They'll do something that other firms are doing. Fundamentally, they'll make a piece of hardware. They'll make a phone, they'll make an iPod, they'll make an MP3 player, they'll make a computer. But that computer will be different from everybody else. And it's different because of two fundamental differentiation vectors that Apple believes in. One is ease of use, and the other is industrial design, the look and feel of the product. So even when Apple does something that is sustaining, they will make sure that it still is unique. The second part of the formula is Apple will always do something reframing. They will find an overlooked or underserved need in a market, a customer problem or a customer aspiration, and they will solve that problem or aspiration. And they will introduce that as a core part of the value proposition. So if you think about an MP3 player, they had an iPod. It was a piece of hardware, but the fundamental problem with iPod users or MP3 player users was, how do I access the content? How do I download the content? How do I organize the content? How do I sync the content? And how do I do all of that without going to jail? Because prior to iTunes, we were doing peer-to-peer file sharing, and that was essentially illegal. So there was an overlooked, underserved need. Apple found it, addressed it, built the ecosystem of iTunes, and now that's the dominant platform that people use to get their content. Then came the phone. And of course, with the phone, there were both problems and aspirations that were not being served. The problem was, we don't want to carry two phones. We don't want to carry one for business, one for pleasure. We just want one that does it all. We want access to our computing on a mobile environment. And we want the phone to be more than a phone. We want it to do other things. We want it to be a personal device. And a lot of those problems were solved through, of course, the App Store, which is now the real customization platform that people use to make the device meaningful and relevant to their own lives. So you look at Apple's formula in a category, and you'll see that they're doing both sustaining and reframing at the same time. Then they'll overlay the third part of the platform. The third part of the platform is a unique customer experience. If you go into the standard Apple store, you'll see that that's unlike any other retail experience at all. And then finally, they'll roll all of that up in a clearly defined brand image and reputation, which essentially stands for the word cool, right?
So I want to hear more about their customers, because
Sure.
as you know, Apple started with very niche kind of
Sure.
customer loyalists, and it grew. And I know you've talked about happy prisoners. Talk about how they've been able to expand their brand with their customer base.
Sure. The goal of innovation ultimately, if you think about why we even bother to innovate, we're obviously innovating for a business purpose, right? We're not doing it just because it's interesting to do. There has to be a business result. So if you look at innovation closely and you try and find the link through to business results, you can find a very strong link between innovation and customer loyalty. Innovation is a source of competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is a source of customer loyalty. So it's important to understand what kind of loyalty we're talking about. There's a lot written about that. But one of the main distinctions is we try to identify the difference between customers who are passive and active. We have customers coming back, some of them are passive, others are active. When you look at somebody like Apple, they're targeting attitudinal loyalty. They're targeting these active supporters of their business, the happy prisoners. And you'll have people who are not Apple users, and they'll look at the Apple system and they'll say that's a closed system, and the customer is captive to that system, and the customer has very little choice about how they can modify that system. But that's being done for a reason. It's being done to give the customer a unique experience which is relevant to them, that drives the advocacy. So when you look at Apple's loyalty scores, you will find that they are at the top of the category in every category that they're in terms of advocates and attitudinally loyal customers. And those scores are around 70 to 75% of the Apple customer base would be in that state of loyalty. But the important thing to realize is that that loyalty is only created through a particular kind of innovation. It's only created through innovation that is reframing and shows the customer a new way of solving their problems or fulfilling their aspirations. And it's only done through innovation that is unique. Innovation that differentiates you from everybody else and gives the customer a reason to talk about you and a reason to be a happy prisoner.
So just delving a little bit deeper into that, so if you were to juxtapose what Apple did with, say, BlackBerry, I mean, trying to get a sense of where one succeeds and another fails.
Sure. Well, it's quite interesting because BlackBerry actually had the loyalty in the smartphone business for a very long period of time, but they thought about that device as in a very narrow fashion. So the device was a phone and an email device and a messaging device. And it was providing a very specific outcome, which was secure email in a corporate environment. Of course, that meant if you were working in a corporation or in a business, you had to have a separate phone to do all your non-business stuff. And I think Apple recognized that problem and BlackBerry didn't. Or if they did recognize it, they didn't do anything about it. So they began to lose loyalty. They began to lose their strong customer loyalty, first in North America and then globally. And I think they found it very, very difficult to challenge the assumptions. Even when they were pushed to fundamentally rethink the role of BlackBerry and the design of BlackBerry, they were still tied to their existing core competencies and assets. They were tied to their global captive server network, which is what they used to send these secure emails around the world. And they found it very difficult to think outside of that set of core competencies. So another challenge in innovation is this concept of core competencies, where managers and leaders believe that core competencies are necessary and will protect the firm forever. And what we learn from innovation is that nothing lasts forever, not even the firm's core competencies. And so you see examples of that in companies like Microsoft, where today there's new core competencies in search, in mobile, in cloud, in content, and those core competencies have been developed by somebody else first. So if you're the incumbent, you can probably see them, but it's actually quite hard to reverse engineer those competencies and regain the lead.
So another example I've heard you speak of is Kodak and digital photography. So again, how does that dramatize what you're talking about in terms of not being afraid of risk-taking and also the infrastructure of a company?
Yeah, there's a couple of things in the Kodak story, which is well known, but not just Kodak. There are many other examples that we can mention in a moment. But one of the problems with a successful business is that you have an innovation, and if it's not sustaining, it's something different, as digital cameras were, the risk you run is you take it to your mainstream customer. Another example is higher education. If you're a university and you're teaching students face-to-face, and along comes online education, which commoditizes the content of a university. So what do you do about that? Well, one tempting thing to do about that is to show it to your mainstream stakeholders or customers. However, the mainstream stakeholder is a customer of yours today because of what you're doing today. They've already made their choice. So when you present them with something different, they're probably not going to see the value in what you've done. When you ask them what to do, they're going to tell you to do more of what you are already doing. And that is exactly what happened with Kodak. They showed the digital camera to a professional photographer. Professional photographer wants resolution. The resolution of the first digital camera was less than a megapixel, and so automatically the professional photographer said that's not an attractive solution. We're not interested. So the problem with reframing innovation is it is either addressing a problem faced by customers that you don't have, or it's addressing a problem that you've not yet been able to find with your customers. And so if you are going to talk to your mainstream customers, one of the things you have to do is ask them a fundamentally different question. You don't ask them what to do to improve what already exists. You don't ask them how to make a better film. You have to stand back from the current product set and say, well, what are the overlooked or underserved problems and aspirations that you have as a customer that we're not currently addressing? And of course, if you'd done that at Kodak, you would have found that people would like, particularly bad photographers, would have liked to be able to take 100 photos without it costing them a lot of money, so that they could find the one good one and put it on their Facebook site and have their friends come along and say, wow, you're a great photographer. So if you are going to talk to your mainstream customers, you need to engage them in a fundamentally different dialogue. Not how to improve what we're already doing, but what are we not doing? What are the latent things that we haven't yet seen?
Or maybe it sounds like you're saying you have to step outside of your mainstream.
That's the other approach, of course. You step out of, if you want to find out what you're not doing, that you could be doing, you obviously talk to a non-customer. Somebody who's not a customer is not a customer for a reason. They don't see the value there.
What about Google? What's your
Well,
take
Google.
on? Yeah.
Yeah, of course, Google is a fascinating example of a company that lives and dies by reframing innovation. In the vernacular, it's called moonshots. They're not interested in taking something that other people have already done. They're interested in, again, fundamentally rethinking how value is created in an industry. Everything from automobiles to search. And so I think that's a culture where people are attracted to the organization. The best people are attracted to the organization because they can be part of something that is creating a new future. And I think Amazon's fairly similar. So the real asset that these organizations have, of course, is the ability to attract the best human talent. Because these people are motivated not just by money, but by the opportunity to create something. And so if you're an established organization and you're not offering people these opportunities, you run the long-term risk that you're not attracting the best human capital. So when you look at organizations like Google and you're an outsider, you tend to think what they're doing is risky because they're creating new markets and they're creating new approaches to value in existing markets. And you say there's so much uncertainty associated with that, it's too risky. And that is true about all disruptive and reframing innovation. It's a highly uncertain world. But the thing to remember is that there's risk in everything. If there's risk in not changing, there's risk in not reframing. In fact, the longer and longer you go on doing the same thing, the more and more likely it is that you're going to become irrelevant. We have Blockbuster being replaced by Netflix. We have Nescafe being replaced by Starbucks. We have universities being replaced by online education. We have venture capitalists being replaced by Kickstarter. And if you looked at all of the incumbents and you looked at them today and said, well, where's the greatest risk? Is the greatest risk in staying the same, or is the greatest risk taking on the uncertainty of disruptive and reframing innovation? And in case after case after case, what you will find is the greatest risk is actually the risk of not reframing, of relying too much on the established way of doing things.
And in terms of the way they're doing things, again, in the news we can talk about Yahoo and where they went wrong, compared to what, Google has been doing correctly. Does it come down to, you're talking about attracting the right people, the talent, because they have the ideas, or is it the actual infrastructure, the way the organization's set up, or it's just a combination of both?
Oh, it's a combination of both. It's absolutely the talent. But the main problem is Yahoo itself was born as a disruptor to traditional publishing. But disruptors can be disrupted. And the reason they get disrupted is their disruption model works. And once their disruption model works, they become comfortable with it. And then they try to optimize it, which is exactly what happened at Yahoo. And so the real problem is the failure to anticipate the next iteration of the company's strategy in creating value. And part of that is a scope opportunity. We've defined the business too narrowly. We're not thinking about the other opportunities that we could create for our customers. If you look at what Apple's done, they started with computers, they went to MP3 players, they go to phones, then they go to wearable devices, then they'll go to TVs, then they'll go to cars. And so what they're doing is they're fundamentally redefining the scope of their business all the time. And they're bringing the same formula to that expanding scope. So one of the problems is a leadership problem where we define the scope of the business too rigidly, and we're not thinking about how else we can relate to the customer or to the market. We tend to think we should stick to the knitting and not get distracted. And we also have this successful way of doing things in the past, like Yahoo has done. So I don't think Yahoo was looking for the scope opportunities to expand its relationship and its relevance to the customer. And the attention of management is the scarce resource. And so what I think you saw at Yahoo and what you see at many companies that get disrupted is the bulk of somebody's attention is on day-to-day optimization of an existing business model. And the more attention you put onto that, the less attention there is for managers to be thinking about how to reframe. So the scarce resource is never money. The scarce resource is the attention span of leaders and managers of the business. And it takes a very, very courageous and strong commitment to rebalance that attention span.
So does it really all come down to leadership? And if it does, what about Apple going forward? There's no Steve Jobs. You don't have any crystal ball predictions?
Well, sure, it absolutely comes down to leadership. But I think what you've seen at Apple is you can distill the innovation principles into a formula. And so long as the leaders stick to that formula is going to produce results. And that formula, as I mentioned, something sustaining, something reframing, some other things in the middle, all wrapped up around a very clearly focused differentiation plan and customer loyalty objective. Mm-hmm. So what you will hear is that Apple doesn't listen to customers very often. That's a bit of a misstatement. Mm-hmm. Apple is one of the most customer-centric organizations we know, but it's true it doesn't necessarily engage customers the way other organizations would do. But always at the center of their thinking is, where's the overlooked, underserved customer problem or aspiration that we can address? And I think so long as that is the center of the innovation thinking, the innovation is going to be relevant. There's kind of two ways to innovate. One is resource-led, where we look at our skills and assets and see how they can give us an unfair advantage in a market. And the other is customer-led, which is the search for the latent problems and aspirations that customers have. So you clearly need to do both. But the risk in the resource-led is you're never quite sure if it's relevant to the market. Mm-hmm. So until you do the customer-led discovery, you really are not sure that what you're looking at is going to be relevant to a paying customer.
What about identifying innovative opportunities?
Well, as I said, it's kind of related to the previous comment. If you're going to look for innovation opportunities, I think you first have to have clear in your mind what the portfolio of innovation is going to look like. We use portfolios to balance risk. The risk of sustaining innovation is ultimately the risk of being irrelevant. The risk of reframing innovation is the uncertainty associated with that type of innovation, so many unknowns. So we have a vision risk, which is we're not sure we've identified the problem correctly. And we have the implementation risk, which is can we build it? So we have both types of risk. So when you're looking for innovation, you have to be clear about what mix of sustaining and reframing you're looking for. I think if you're looking for sustaining innovation opportunities, that's pretty straightforward. We're always talking to our customers about how to improve what's already there. If you're looking about reframing innovation, you have to try a different approach. You can't even do benchmarking, because if you benchmark yourself against your competitors, you're always looking at something that already exists. And reframing innovation doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So we need methodologies and techniques that help us to find things that don't currently exist. So one of the tools that I use quite often with organizations to help that process and that thinking is to engage the customer in a dialogue around an imaginary provider of value in an industry. And we start that conversation by suggesting that all existing providers have disappeared. They've all gone bankrupt because they failed to create sufficient value. And then we start again by designing a greenfields startup organization that is going to do everything the customer wants in the perfect world. It's going to deliver the best imaginable value to a customer. Mm-hmm. And so we get the customer to begin to articulate what that might be. What are the outcomes that would be best imaginable? What are the experiences that would be best imaginable? And we facilitate that dialogue with the customer to find all of the things that currently don't exist.
How do you pull out that, those unmet needs if they don't even know what those unmet needs are?
Well, again, this is the comment about Apple, which is customers don't know what they want. So therefore you're wasting your time talking to customers. It's totally true that customers don't know what the solution is. But it's all equally true that customers always know what the problem is, and they always know what their aspiration is. So the dialogue is never a dialogue looking for solutions. It's a dialogue looking for latent problems and latent aspirations. So there's only two reasons anybody ever buys a product from anybody. Mm-hmm. One is to solve a problem, remove pain. The other is to pursue pleasure, fulfill an aspiration, right? When you drill down to it, that's the only reason anybody does business with any company anywhere. Mm-hmm. So if you want to be relevant, which is really what innovation is about, then we start the conversation there. And that's the most valuable output of a customer dialogue, customer discovery dialogue. Where are the opportunities for us to deliver new outcomes, new experiences that keep the organization relevant in the market, right? And so what we're thinking about with our sustaining innovation is this is our way of being relevant today, but what we're looking for with the reframing innovation is this is how we intend to be relevant tomorrow. And if you're not always balancing those two, then you're at risk of becoming irrelevant. Innovation can fail for two primary reasons. If we're talking about reframing or disruptive innovation, the first reason it can fail is vision risk. Vision is the specification of the customer need. I see a need in the market. I see a need for a better taxi service. That could be an illusion, or you might not really define that opportunity clearly enough. You also then have to have the concept of the solution. Okay, so if we're not going to have a taxi service, what are we going to have? Well, we have the concept of Uber. Well, that's a very specific solution to a very specific problem. You could misspecify the problem or you could misspecify the solution. That's called vision risk. Now you've got to build it. Can we get away with introducing Uber? Can we convince governments to let us do it? Right? We have Uber tackling governments head on, trying to get permission to do something disruptive to an incumbent. And we have the incumbent screaming about all of those unfair advantages that supposedly Uber has. That's called implementation risk. Which of those two is the greatest risk? Typically, it's the vision risk. So I like to think about innovation not as a technology problem, not as a technology opportunity, but as a business model opportunity, where we just take standardized technology and we do something interesting with it and we create a new form of business. How do you minimize vision risk? One of the best ways to minimize vision risk is to be in touch with the lead user in an industry. And the lead user is somebody who is very sophisticated about the problems and the solutions in an industry. They're not your customer. They're not your customer because you don't have a solution. This is probably a customer who's going to build the solution themselves. So if you look at the antivirus companies, the companies like McAfee and the others that provide software to protect your computer, where do they go to find the next problem? They go to the hacker. The hacker is a lead user. He's not my employee, he's not my customer. He's actually out there looking at problems that I haven't even seen and designing solutions to those problems. Now, these lead users exist in every industry in the world. And the trick is to find them and to engage them into a conversation about what is the best imaginable opportunity here and to make them a partner in the innovation process. So it's part of this whole concept that nobody has a monopoly on all good ideas. And if you're looking for the best ideas in an industry, find the people who have the deepest understanding of the problem and the deepest understanding of the solution. And they may or may not be in your customer base.
So how do you set that up in the global context? You know, it's a global economy, global companies. What do they need to do differently, or do they just do it the same way? How do they?
Sure, well, the innovation in a global context is a really interesting conversation. The thing about innovation is it's widely distributed. Nobody has a monopoly on innovation. No one company, no one country, no one industry has a monopoly on all good ideas. So if you accept that innovation and smart ideas are distributed and distributed globally, then the way you think about global markets is you think about them as a source of innovation and a source of new opportunity. I work with a lot of companies who describe themselves as global companies, yes, But in reality, and that includes a lot of the companies in Silicon Valley,
Right.
some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley. They describe themselves as global, but what they really mean is they're selling globally.
Right.
But when you look at where their innovation is concentrated, it's concentrated in Silicon Valley. So a truly global company will have a distributed network of innovation. They will have innovation going on in different parts of the world. They will choose those specific innovation locations because those locations give the organization access to the most relevant innovation. And each of those nodes in the network will be specialized. So if you think about building a big power transmission grid, which is a solution made by a company called ABB, that particular solution is made up of power transformers, electrical transformers, and a range of other different components that go into the overall solution. And what ABB has done is they've specialized the innovation in each of those components into a different part of the world, where they can gain access to a customer, where they can gain access to technology, where they can gain access to something they need to make the best solution. But the uniqueness of that network is each of those nodes is specialized, and they come together in the best solution for the market. So it's specialized, distributed, and it's aimed at tapping into the innovation wherever it lies in the globe.
How does this relate to what I've seen your research on what you call multi-domestic versus global market structures?
Sure. Well, again, when you're looking at market opportunity globally, you really have a choice about how you go and search for opportunity. So there's innovation in how you search for opportunity. Historically, what a lot of companies have done is they've divided the market up geographically. This is quite common, again, in global businesses. We have North America, we have Latin America, we have Asia Pacific, we have Europe and Middle East, and managers have divided the world up into regions. But if you ask the question of what's unique about customer needs, what's common about customer needs across those regions, very often what you can find is something called a global business segment. One of the companies that's really good at this is now the world's largest appliance manufacturer, which is Electrolux, a Swedish company. And it was transformed in the late 80s, early 90s by a couple of new owners. And they transformed the business by asking a very simple question. Let's ignore geography. Let's just look for similarities in customer needs across geographies. And so, for example, they found a group of customers who wanted a washing machine that imitated the natural hand washing motion that you'll often find in some countries around the world. And it turned out those customers were in Africa, they were in China, they were in Latin America. So in reality, because we'd carved the world up into regions expecting to find differences, we were not able to see these similarities until we put aside the geographic differences and started looking for these similarities. Those similarities give us economies of scale. We can make one product that we can sell around the world. It makes the marketing easier. We don't have to change the marketing. We don't have to change the product. And so we can get economies of scale in all aspects of the business model. A multi-domestic market structure says no. Every country is unique, and I have to change to suit the needs of that country. In that world, what you need is knowledge of the local market. But if you're looking at a global business segment, the key core competency is knowledge of the segment, not necessarily knowledge of an individual country. So again, you can see innovation in how people think about the global opportunity. And if somebody's been able to find a global business segment, then very often they can gain advantages that will make it very difficult for a multi-domestic competitor to survive. I believe that particularly in global, most companies are on a journey where they start with limited exports and then they distribute their value chain and then they build a truly globally distributed network. So I think it's just realizing what that journey is and anticipating the next phase of the journey. And that's the nature of innovation in general. If you look at who gets to maintain the lead, it's nearly always the firm that is anticipating the next iteration of their business. So you'll see a company like Sony that once iterated, but then forgot to iterate again. So it went from minnow in consumer electronics to the dominant player, but then did not have the next iteration of its innovation strategy ready to go. And you compare that with somebody like Amazon, who is constantly reiterating the next focus of its business. And you'll see that the whole definition of the core business is fundamentally evolving as they learn more and more about what those opportunities are. So they're not reacting, they're actually anticipating. And they're thinking many years in advance, not next quarter.
Is that kind of thinking and reiteration more associated with startups? Is that something that that businesses need to take on, that kind of approach?
Well, if you look at the nature of disruption and the nature of startups, let's call startups disruptors because they're trying to do something somebody hasn't done before. And if you look at what enables all disruptive innovation, what you will find is there is a latent, overlooked customer need. You can pick virtually any disruptor and ask what allowed that organization to enter the market. What is allowing Uber and Lyft to disrupt the taxi service? What allowed Netflix to disrupt Blockbuster? And every single time you answer that question, what you're going to find is there was a frustrated customer somewhere. And that frustrated customer had a need, they had a problem, or they had an aspiration that was being ignored by everybody. So startups are just a manifestation of that thinking. But there is absolutely no reason why an incumbent, an established provider, cannot use that thinking to feed a different part of its portfolio. So if you're an incumbent, what you're ultimately trying to do is you're trying to run two parallel innovation models at the same time. You're trying to run a sustained innovation model, which is improving what's already there. You're trying to run a reframing innovation model, which is trying to find these latent or overlooked opportunities in a market. But the trick is they are fundamentally different innovation cultures. We call them different innovation governance models. And when you look at the culture and the management model for sustaining innovation and for reframing innovation, you will find they differ on every strategic dimension. They differ on strategic intent. Sustaining innovation wants to improve what's already existing, and you want to become best in class. The strategic intent of reframing innovation is to create what doesn't exist and to become unique class. The time frame is different. Time frame for sustaining innovation is 6 months to 2 years. Time framing for reframing innovation is 2 to 10 years. The amount of information we have about it, about the opportunity, is totally different. With sustaining innovation, we know everything. We know the customer, we know the segments, we know the features of the product, we know the competitors. With reframing innovation, we know nothing. And if somebody says they have an answer to the business case question, they're not telling you the truth. The key success factors are different. The key success factor in sustaining innovation is time to market. You've got competitors breathing down your neck. Who gets there first? With reframing innovation, you normally don't have a competitor, you're pioneering. But you have another challenge. You have to prove the concept and you have to educate the market because the customer doesn't actually know what you're about to do. And the great case there is TiVo. TiVo was the first digital video recorder. And they had to spend 10 times the amount of money that they spent on product development trying to educate the market about what is a digital video recorder and how do you use it and how do you get the most out of it. So we go through all of the dimensions of business case analysis and business planning, and what we find is these are two radically different innovation cultures. And unless the leaders of an organization understand those differences, what happens is all of the great ideas get sucked into one business case model. And it's a business case model that was designed to support sustaining innovation. So all of the great reframing ideas either never make it through, or they get compromised, or they get delayed. And I think this is the greatest challenge for an incumbent, is to understand you need this mix of sustaining and reframing. You need to understand that they are radically different innovation governance models and cultures and leadership models, and they're different business case models, and you need to run them separately, but in parallel. What you cannot do is ask the same team to do both. You need two different teams, each of them running under a very different innovation model. What a lot of companies will do is they will adopt what's called a reactor strategy. They'll let somebody else pioneer because they think it's too risky. And the theory here is, well, we'll just let somebody else pioneer. We'll figure out what works, and then we'll reverse engineer, and we'll out-imitate, and we'll take over the lead. Nice theory. It only works when you have what's called a friendly learning environment. Friendly learning environment means you can actually understand what the first mover did, you can actually build something similar, and you can actually build something better. In other words, the lessons of the first mover are available to you. But if you take something like search engines and you look at Microsoft, you will see that that's not a friendly learning environment at all. It's quite hostile. The lessons of the first mover are very difficult to understand, and even more difficult to reverse engineer, and even more difficult to out-imitate. And so you see Bing as a competitor to Google flailing. It's not the leader, it's a follower. So the ultimate challenge faced by companies like Yahoo and Microsoft and every other incumbent is, at what point do I adopt the pioneering posture? At what point do I actually take the lead in creating the new forms of value in my market? And there is certainly risk associated with that, but the risk of not doing so is ultimately even greater.
So would your final word of advice to business leaders be to take the risk?
All risk can be managed. The first step is to understand that there's risk in everything. And the way you can manage that risk is to hold a diversified portfolio of innovation. And the key part of that diversification is, of course, to leverage your heritage as a successful business and continue to do sustaining innovation to improve what's already there. But at the same time, to be looking for the next generation of relevance as an organization. To be looking for the next way of being relevant in a market and creating value in a market. So, can you see examples of that? We know that Nescafé was a great instant coffee business. It got disrupted by Starbucks because Starbucks introduced the notion of the coffee experience, which meant nobody wants to drink instant coffee anymore. So if you're Nescafé, you have a wonderful business made up of instant coffee, suddenly imploding on you.
Although full circle, Starbucks now sells instant coffee.
Well, of course. And the reason they sell instant coffee is because Nescafé ultimately responded to the threat of Starbucks by introducing the Nespresso machine, which allows us to have the coffee experience at home. And the Nespresso machine, of course, is instant coffee, but now bundled up into a different experience for a customer. And so that's now causing a problem for Starbucks. So Starbucks is now selling instant coffee. So the interesting lesson from Nescafé, however, Nestlé, however, is that the germ of the idea for the Nespresso machine was created inside the parent. But it was not until they freed a team of managers up from the parent culture and set it apart from the parent culture that the Nespresso machine finally came to life and finally took the form that we know and recognize today as a really great innovation. So this is part of the whole conversation about how do I balance this sustaining innovation with reframing innovation. And very often in many organizations, it's very difficult to do the reframing from within the parent. So some people will have a spin-off, as Nestle ultimately did, but it's not really necessary. If you understand what's different about about the sustaining and the reframing innovation cultures and governance models, and if you're prepared to live by them and let the two different teams be evaluated and resourced and judged separately, then they can coexist within the same parent. Apple is a company that is often content to come late, but with the image of technology leadership. And they can do that because they're learning from the mistakes of others, and they're learning how to integrate, and they're learning how to build platforms. So if you compare Apple to Samsung, and you go back to the Apple formula, a piece of hardware, a platform for content or for applications, a retail experience, and a brand that is clearly defined around the image of cool. And you say, well, how many of those elements does Samsung have? And the answer is one. They have hardware. And the hardware may be more advanced than the Apple hardware. But Apple isn't selling you hardware. Apple is selling you the entire integration of all of those elements. They're selling you the ecosystem, they're selling you the brand, they're selling you the retail experience, and they're selling you the hardware. And they're selling you the affinity of being an Apple fan. Samsung has no retail experience. They're trying to open Samsung stores in Best Buy. Do you think that experience is going to outperform going to an Apple store? Of course not. And so what you have to realize is innovation is not just hardware. It is not just technology. It's the ability to combine things in new ways, create new platforms like the App Store, like iTunes, and put them into an integrated customer experience that is unique and reframes how people think about a phone. This is exactly why BlackBerry disappeared. The BlackBerry is designed to do one thing really well. The iPhone was designed to do an infinite number of things reasonably well, where the infinite number of things is chosen by you. Therefore, this becomes a device that is now personal, right? And that's the trick. How do I customize this thing called a smartphone so that everybody thinks this is the most relevant possible appendage to their daily behavior?
Does it not then get down to the brand identity, the brand affinity, the integration that you're talking about? I mean, Apple has always been a completely identifiable brand and in an aspirational way. And if you're just talking about, like when you were talking, I was thinking about Geek Squad, Genius Bar.
Of course. Yeah.
I mean, it's
which one do you want to identify with? Do you want to be seen as a geek or do you want to be seen as a genius?
So again, is that the brilliance of someone like Steve Jobs from the beginning, he wanted, like you said, the happy prisoners. He wanted everything to be all part of his one vision.
Well, that is absolutely true. But what we need to accept is that innovation of the kind that Apple does is not contingent on a visionary. It's now encoded as a formula. It's now a consistent way of attacking a category that they didn't belong to. They didn't belong to phones. They didn't belong to MP3 players. They didn't belong to watches. They don't belong to TVs. They don't belong to cars. But they will be there. And they will use the formula. They'll make a car. But they will do something else that supports the car. They will have an experience similar to what Tesla might be providing. If you talk to Tesla owners, what do they love about the car? They love the fact that it's a living product. It's a piece of software on wheels. And so what Tesla is doing is upgrading the software once a month so that the owners can go into their garage once a month, turn it on, and it will do something it never did before. And so it's a dynamic experience, and that's what you're getting from Apple, it's what you're getting from Tesla, it's what you're going to get from a lot of other people as well. And so what you don't want is to believe that to be an innovative company, I have to have a Steve Jobs. That is not the case. You don't need a Steve Jobs. You just need a commitment to being willing to reframe. And then you use all of the tools that are available to you to go out and find those opportunities. And then you design an organization that runs a reframing innovation process separate from the sustaining innovation process, and you commit.
But are you saying that?
You commit.
Are you saying then that a Steve Jobs or a Schultz or any one of these that really changed the way that we experience our lives, that they understood the formula? And that's why they're successful, and they're passing it down now to the people?
They hadn't codified the formula. But what do we do? What do we do when we see something successful? We always try and codify what's been done there. And so I don't think for 1 minute Steve was a formula guy. He was inspired, but the principles of his inspiration are what we need to capture. And the principles were, where is the overlooked, underserved problem? And how can I put that into a really compelling experience for somebody? Does Apple give you everything? No, of course not. You don't want, that's a huge mistake. All good strategy says you're going to make trade-offs. You're going to give the customer something that matters to them, and you're going to deny them everything else. So what does Apple give you in the hardware? It gives you ease of use and cool design. What do you not get? You do not get good battery life. The battery life is terrible. Okay, that's good strategy because they're making a trade-off and they're clear about what matters to the experience, and they're clear about what matters to their brand, and everything else supports that. So I think the opportunity for all of us is to take some of the codified knowledge about how you do good innovation and how you too can become the next Apple or the next Google and apply it in a world where it currently doesn't exist. Apply the innovation principles in a world where it doesn't currently exist, because somebody is looking at your market. The other thing we know about reframing innovation is no industry is immune. No industry is immune. The French wine industry, they owned the wine industry for centuries, but in the last 25 years have lost it because of New World wine competitors in Australia, Chile, Argentina, South Africa. No industry is immune. So if you don't have a Steve Jobs in your industry, here's the chance for you to be that mantle, to be that visionary.
Well, thank you for all your information, your points of view, and I think we'll all be thinking, you've helped me reframe how I think of innovation. So
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the topic.